Good evening, everybody. You're here watching the Gettysburg panel, members of the Capital District Civil War Roundtable. My name is Nick Toney, and to my left is Rosemary Nichols, Mark Bodner, Michael Barrett, Bob Mulligan, and Matt George. Thank you guys for joining me. We'll start with Bob, if Bob wants to tell us sort of his experience with the Battle of Gettysburg and maybe how many times he's been to Gettysburg and how he got interested in the Civil War.
Well, the first book I got out of the library at school for in Albany was The Civil War. And I read it and I didn't understand any of it, and I've been trying to understand it ever since. So anyway, Gettysburg, I was there in 1964.
Oh, wow.
63 rather. For the centennial.
We'll post that picture separately. That is worth a closer look right there.
Yeah, that's nice.
Oh, thank you.
I was the drum major of a fife and drum corps, and three of my buddies and I made up phony uniforms with the World War II rifle sling, the World War II olive drab poncho, my desert boots with the black shoe polish on them, the World War I Canadian haversack, and we went down and had a blast. So ever since
Where
then,
were you going? To Gettysburg?
we went and took part in the battle at Hanover, Pennsylvania, the reenactment at Wrightsville, where they burned the railroad bridge over the Susquehanna, and then we fell in with the Sons of Union Veterans at the site itself on the battlefield. This was before the National Park Service put the kibosh on that. So yeah, we were gone about a week or 10 days, and we had a blast. So since then, I've been back numerous times. Personally, I am not a big fan of Gettysburg. I think there are other battles that are more interesting and maybe even more important, but be that as it may, Gettysburg, of course, is important because, as I tell people, that is where Dwight Eisenhower beat Robert E. Lee.
There you are.
And of course, we'll get into a bigger discussion about the significance of the battle and during the war and after the war, because I think its legend sort of grew even more after the war. Matt?
Well, as a really young boy, I played with Civil War soldiers. And then when I was 14, I had relatives in Maryland, and they invited me down, and it wasn't Gettysburg, it was Manassas, Bull Run. And that, and for some reason, a tremendous interest in history and the Civil War soldiers, and then playing board games with the Civil War when I was in college, and then eventually in teaching 8th grade social studies, a colleague of mine once complained to me good-naturedly, but he complained to me and he said, "Matt, you take longer to teach it than they did to fight it." And then became a roundtable member in '86, and Bob said he was doing some living history or reenacting when he was younger. I had to wait until I retired when one of our members, Howie Young, would come to my classroom and do living history in my classroom. And I told him, "Howie, when I retire, this looks like fun. I'm going to be doing that." And I've been doing that in the schools for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the reverse.
Right. Rosemary?
Well, I grew up in the West, way out in the West, so it wasn't as if there was any major Civil War battlefields within 1,000 miles of Prescott, Arizona. The only Civil War battlefield in the West is Picasso Peak, which is a glancing cavalry engagement between the Confederate and the Union cavalry, and there was one poor unfortunate Union soldier who was killed in the battle. But for years and years and years, they didn't even have a real monument. They have now cured that, so that you can actually see that this is where they think that Gaucho Peak happened. But I thought it was really interesting, and so when I was a junior, between my junior and senior year in high school, I decided to write the Great American Civil War novel, me and Margaret Mitchell. Fortunately, I gave up and did other things with my life, but I never stopped being interested in it. And then when I moved from Seattle area to Chicago area to Albany, the most interesting battle that was close, from my perspective, was Gettysburg. And so that was the one that I got to know better than the others. And I just thought there were lots of ways in which Gettysburg was a really interesting battle. I'm more interested in sort of the human interest piece of the battles, and so that's why that's the tug for me. And so that's how I came to be interested in Gettysburg.
And you say it so nicely, you say it properly too, right? Because so many of us say Gettysburg, and you say Gettysburg.
That's what I was slapped severely about the head and shoulders long enough that I finally learned how to pronounce it.
Right. Mark.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me here today.
Thank you.
It was totally unexpected. But my indoctrination into Gettysburg happened when I was in grammar school. Had a teacher that was from Camp Hill, which is up near Harrisburg, and she loved Civil War. She liked Civil War and World War II. So when it came time for American history class, she talked a lot about Gettysburg. So I knew when I was in seventh grade that Pickett's charge wasn't like F Troop and a cavalry attack. You know, we knew back then. It wasn't until 1990 that I was able to get to Gettysburg, and I just loved the battlefield. I wasn't expecting anything of what I saw. 2 years later, I was invited to go to a talk up at the Lansingburg Historical Society. The speaker was a guy you might have heard of. His name was Robert Mulligan. And he was wearing his Civil War uniform and gave a nice Civil War talk there. Well, sitting behind me at that meeting was a gentleman by the name of Michael P. Barrett, Esquire. And at the time that Bob Mulligan tipped his head down to say, "What's this red cross on top of my cap?" The guy behind me says, "A bullseye?" I was hooked. I mean, you know, I had no chance after that. But what my main interest in the Civil War, of course, Gettysburg, largest battle in the East, and a lot of local guys fought there, and that's my main interest.
Yes.
What local guys, not only from this area, but buried in this area, did at Gettysburg. And so that's what I've been focusing on.
Not buried not too far from here, a lot of them in the Albany Rural Cemetery.
Just so you know, I'm documenting them. I've got 1,075 so far.
You're over
Wow.
1,000?
Wow.
1,075.
Well, so there's some work to come there and a lot of stories. for
In
us to
Albany
learn.
Rural Cemetery, we have 27 generals, 3 Confederates, 6 Civil War Medal of Honor recipients, and a partridge in a pear tree.
We could do a whole program on
We
that.
could.
Yeah. And maybe we will.
And how?
Yeah, I
Yes.
hope you guys are, this
I-
is just the first of many.
I just mentioned, when we were at that seminar, we had a tour, and we're having the gentleman speak to us next year, but he was talking about Rice, and I immediately spoke up and said, well, he's buried in Albany Rural Cemetery.
Yeah.
And he quoted I'll have to ask about you about this later. He read a unbelievable quote that Rice made to the New York Times, I believe it was, many years after the war, as to why the war was fought and why he fought at Gettysburg. And I've got the date. I'll have to ask you later if you.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah. Okay.
Michael.
Well, I've been a history buff as long as I can remember being alive. The Civil War, really, I think the genesis of my interest there, Christmas of 1963, you were down at the battlefield, and I was 11, and my Aunt Jean bought me Bruce Catton's 3-volume history of the war. And I still own it, and in the flyleaf it says, Christmas 1963. I know this is too advanced for you now, but in years to come, you're really going to like this. And by April, I had read it cover to cover twice, and that's the year walking past this white marble sarcophagus in Oakwood Cemetery in Troy that I had seen before, beautiful carved eagle holding an officer's scabbard in his claws, and across the front of it, it says General George H. Thomas. George Henry Thomas is the Rock of Chickamauga. I now know because I read Bruce Catton. What the hell would he be doing in Troy, New York? Boom. From there on in, it's just, Civil War became one of my prime topics, and all history, but the Civil War really just became my number one, and to this day, it still is. So. And Oakwood has 9.5 Civil War generals, and yes, 1 Medal of Honor recipient, and no Confederates.
So we've got a lot of local connections over
Major
here.
general.
Excuse me?
You have a major general.
Well, yes, actually, we have several, but yes. We have a running battle about, who has more and more famous dead people than,
That sounds like a dangerous battle.
Yeah, it's unarmed, yes.
Okay.
It's a battle of wits, he's unarmed, yes.
Right. So I think a good place to start is with a completely different battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville, which is 2 months before Gettysburg in early May, and by all standards, it was an absolute Union disaster. And the Union Army is a mess. Their leadership is a mess. And I think going into Gettysburg, for better or for worse, a lot of Union generals are influenced by what happens at Chancellorsville. So if everybody wants to go around and sort of mention something about Chancellorsville and how you think it sort of ties to Gettysburg, and how maybe what happened there was important to what happened at Gettysburg, or anything relating to the in-between period. Bob, do you have anything?
Yes, I just want to point out, you asked the question, how were the armies different? Well, all of the New York 2 years regiments left after Chancellorsville.
That's right.
And I'm just trying to remember how many of them there were. 33 regiments? Something like 13,000 veterans gone.
Yes.
Wow.
So when you actually look at the Army of the Potomac, a lot of new people have to be brought in.
That must have made me just feel wonderful. Here, sir, you're getting to command an army, and we just sent them all home.
Yeah.
Well, it scared the hell out of Hooker, of course, who's commanding from Chancellorsville up until right before, because he had, well, what many of us call McClellan disease. Bobby Lee has me outnumbered. Well, no, he doesn't. But I'm going to convince myself, and I'm going to scream and yell at Halleck until he sends me reinforcements, and then he's got thousands of veteran troops who end up leaving right after Chancellorsville. And so suddenly his fear is already compounded, and now he's just lost, in his mind, the core of his army. He's terrified, and that's why when he sends demanding Halleck and the president give him more reinforcements or relieve me, okay, That's an easy
Yeah,
decision, yes.
I-
And that's, you've already mentioned, when George Gordon Meade writes to his wife afterwards and says, an officer from Washington showed up in my tent this morning and said he's about to ruin my day. And Meade thinks, well, I'm either being relieved of my command or I'm being arrested. And his reply is, well, I have a clear conscience. And the officer says, well, here's the orders relieving Hooker and appointing you into command of the Army of the Potomac. Oh, God, you just ruined my day.
And to make matters worse,
I think he actually inferred it was like they were sentencing him to death.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
yeah.
There's some
I
sort
mean,
of a
you
quote there.
just ruined my
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
Oh.
and to make matters worse, the army was split up at that point. Hooker, and there was a tense exchange between Meade and Hooker once Meade took command of the army about that and the state of the army. And I think today is the anniversary of Meade taking over the Army of the Potomac in June 27th or June 28th.
28th,
Today?
I think. I think
Okay,
it's
so he
tomorrow.
got command of the army 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg,
Yep.
which is just incredible.
Based on some of the
yeah.
people I've talked to, all those things are true, but the comparison of the degree of demoralization of the Army and their spirit, it was higher after Chancellorsville as opposed to 62 after Second Bull Run. That the Army still had that sense of we can do this, so to speak. It's not us, it's the fellows who are leading us.
Right.
But a lot better than it was when they all turned tail in Second Bull Run and Polk got destroyed.
Yes, got it, right.
But how about on the Confederate
And-
side? The Confederate side, I think they're flying high. They're invading the North.
Second time, yep.
Yep, for the second time, of course, the Antietam campaign the year prior. Lee,
12,000 green federal troops captured without a shot fired. I mean, the Harper's Valley cowards, many of whom were New York troops.
Yep.
I mean, that was something to make you, sing hallelujahs if you were a patriotic Confederate.
The loss
Army
of
did
Jackson,
well
the
in
loss of Jackson though was, I think, a little bit of a
Downer.
downer
Sure.
after the battle. So
yes, Bob.
But Lee had to rebuild his army too.
Right.
He was sending people down to the Carolinas, and as a result, he got people like the Davis Brigade, the president's nephew, who a lot of, I won't call them raw troops, but
They were.
yeah, I mean, they weren't the Valley, Stonewall's troops in the Valley, that's for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about Lee and his plan for going north, and the reality of what he could have possibly. The what ifs are. I mean, you could do them all day. May or may not be productive, but he probably does have a legitimate shot at maybe capturing Harrisburg at some point, obtaining some kind of victory that plays into some of the war weariness in the North,
Yes.
and potentially bring Lincoln to the table.
I think he was well aware of what any kind of a victory would have done as far as getting help from abroad.
From the Brits and
Yes.
the French.
Yes.
That's what, in my
Okay.
opinion, that's what he was
That's-
aiming at.
But
He's,
I can understand that, but I also think that he had no choices. I mean, he couldn't stay in Virginia because Virginia was just being
Has been
eaten
picked
up.
clean, yeah.
It had been absolutely
Yeah.
picked clean. He had to go someplace. And if you look at the geography around,
There's nowhere
where is
else.
the place that you could have the biggest impact if you're going to go north? And Pennsylvania is it.
Mhm.
And that's why he goes north, so that I think in a sense he has to go north to Pennsylvania, whether he expects to have a spectacular victory or not.
And he lived large off the land in Pennsylvania. They did very well.
They absolutely.
Paying for the stuff with Confederate money all the way.
They
And
did.
I think it's obvious too that once he got there, once the Confederates came upon the Union troops there, it was Robert E. Lee's persona to say, all right, we're going to divert from taking Harrisburg. We're getting over there to fight these guys. But he couldn't help himself, just like the third day at Gettysburg. He had to attack a certain point, which we'll discuss that later in the conversation. But
Well, yeah, that ties into the comment he made to Longstreet after the first day, when Longstreet says, I think we ought to move out, go down to Pipe Creek. Now, if he's there in the morning, we're gonna attack him.
Yep.
That's all
That's
there is.
right.
I'm here, he's there, I'm not maneuvering, we're gonna take him out.
I just want to say we must have been at the same conference, because I remember a speaker saying that Lee had 2 weeks of rations in Virginia when he started.
wow.
North.
So, I mean, if that's true, his hand was forced.
Let's talk about that first day at Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863, and John Buford, of course, a character immortalized by Sam Elliott in the movie Gettysburg, which I think all of us have a love-hate relationship with, an absolutely entertaining movie, great scenes, some of it inaccurate. John Buford, a Kentucky-born general, had a lot of Confederate ties in his family, but he fights for the Union, and he's a great cavalry officer.
From Kentucky, I believe.
Yeah, Kentucky, and he has incredible intelligence. I think the absolute opposite of what the Confederates know they're facing in Gettysburg. Does anybody want to talk about Buford and sort of his plan on day one?
Well, I have always viewed Buford as one of the most interesting people who did what we want to see junior commanding officers do, and that's take charge, to make a decision. That is that when he could have crept away. He didn't have to line his troops up on those hills and set them up so that they fell back and fell back and fell back and fell back, but kept fighting off much larger groups of troops along those ridges.
Buying times
For Reynolds to get up.
Absolutely.
And he made that decision. And, he knew, because he was a very experienced cavalry officer, because he had fought with the Indians in the West. So he knew where he was about. I mean, he wasn't a Custer or a Kilpatrick or any of the others. I mean, he really knew his job. And he knew that when he committed those officers, those soldiers to fighting on those ridges, they was going to probably lose most of them.
Yeah.
But that if he didn't fight them, if he didn't hold them, there had to be, that it was probably going to come washing through with the same kind of awful mistakes that Chancellorsville had been, that Fredericksburg had been, that somebody needed to stand up and in an intelligent way beat off the Confederates. And he did. And so when you see that wonderful scene in Gettysburg, when John Reynolds comes up, and he says, "And what's what's happening? What's happening, John? What's up, John?" And he says,
Gonna be,
"It's going to be hell to pay." And he knew, and I mean, anybody knowing John Buford would know that when he said that was not publicity.
that's
That was not to make you feel
It's
good.
not overstatement,
That was
it's not
his
understatement,
assessment
it's,
of what was actually going to happen at that fight. And I think it's just one of the most important elements in that battle.
One of my favorite stories about Buford was a few days before Gettysburg, he discovers a spy in their midst, and as a warning, he hung the spy and had him displayed on a road that a lot of soldiers went to on the way to Gettysburg. And somebody asked him, "Why didn't you send him to Washington for interrogation?" And he said, "I was afraid they would make him a brigadier general." And so he's a man of action. Yes. And so in Brett Reynolds, or Buford fights brilliantly. Reynolds arrives on the field, I think around 10:30 in the morning, and he's killed shortly after, very shortly into the fight. I think about a half hour in. He's taking a position somebody in his, he probably had no business being where he was when he was shot, but
well, some guys
He's
say,
got to get out
so
and look and see for himself.
Yeah,
I mean, that's important.
you know,
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't being silly.
Yeah.
You know, his luck ran out.
right, okay.
there's been so much written, and I am, believe me, I am a Buford supporter. That's my email address. But there are a number of little interesting things there. Some of that is not only due to his greatness, but to a certain degree the ineptitude of Archer and Heath. In fact, they were, in a sense, you could argue, disobeying orders, because Lee had told them not to bring on a general engagement.
Right.
And you have this situation where it's an interesting tactical situation. He only had a few companies that had breech loaders, and he didn't have repeating rifles like the myth talks about. But in putting those 3/4 of his men, because the other quarter are holding the horses, and putting those 3/4 of the men in those bridges, when he's got them in a line, a lot of that road was fence line. And so as Archer, Harry Heath and that are marching up the road in column, in order to go into battle, they've got to get into a line of battle, which makes it exciting when you have a road with fences. And so half of that time is totally wasted as they're being peppered by Buford's guys, getting
into line of
column
skirmishers
into a line, and by the time they begin to have an effect, Buford's on his horse and he's back at the next bridge again, and that's the brilliance of that. But you know, Harry Heath is not one of the more brilliant people during the war, and then he suffered a head wound, which has its effect later on too as well. So,
Nick, getting back to when Reynolds was killed, the command then devolved upon Abner Doubleday. Yes. And I'd like to know what this august group of people think about relieving Abner Doubleday. Not that Newton was not a good commander or not a good replacement choice, but what's been written about Doubleday being relieved may be false. So I'd just like to know the opinion of everybody here. Is that he was being relieved because they saw his troops falling out of the line, coming back toward Cemetery Hill or
Downtown.
Yeah, and from other things I've read, that wasn't the case at all. You know, you're always going to have some people.
Well, everybody ended up running back to town at some point, yeah.
But and I think that might have been in Coddington that I read that Edwin Coddington spoke.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've always acted under the assumption that he's basically slid out of a command position just because Meade can't trust him. And he's already terrified. I mean, come on, you step into this position, you're in commander's position for 4 days, and all of a sudden you are facing what he's recognizing is going to be a slugfest of a battle. Do you really want somebody standing behind you holding a knife, or do you want somebody out there following your orders?
Doubleday supposedly was not the easiest guy to get along with either.
Yes, he's arrogant and he's very snappish. That's pretty, although so George Gordon Meade.
Gobble-eyed
Old
snapping
turtle. Yes, that's not a nickname you get by being warm and fuzzy. But Yeah, I've always thought it was more military politics than anything else that slid Doubleday out of the way.
And he did the same thing with Howard too, on the same
Well,
day. He
yes.
passed, Howard is the senior general on the field,
Yes.
and he sends Hancock to
Hancock with
relieve him.
written instructions
yes.
saying, we don't care about seniority.
Yeah.
You're taking
Yeah.
the field.
This
And
guy-
Howard gave me
This
that
guy's
ability.
smart, and uh-oh, Howard, no, you're not gonna command until I get up there.
And it hurt Howard's feelings quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, of course it
But
does.
Hancock handled it really well.
Yes, he did, yeah.
He did the right thing.
I mean, I think that was a wise decision that Meade made, and I think that Howard did much better out in the West as one of the secondary commanders with Sherman on the
Yeah.
march to the sea.
Yes.
I think whatever embarrassment he may have had in, being passed over
yes.
at Gettysburg, I think allowed him to recover from in the work that he did in marching from Atlanta to the
In
sea.
the grand scheme of the end of the war, looking back, yes,
That's
Howard
right.
comes
Did he-
across fairly well despite Chancellorsville and, yes, the failure at Gettysburg. And
Yeah.
Well, he tried to claim some credit for the position of Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg.
Yes. Yes.
So, and
Which I think is not unjustified.
Right.
Well,
That
yeah.
somebody had to say, this is where we're gonna stand.
Yes.
I think
And
all of
leaving
it,
von
all of those,
Steinwehr
all of
is a
those
wise choice.
commanders early in the day, at some point in time, there's documentary evidence that all of them recognized the importance of the hills and Cemetery Hill and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
There's, at some point, they all seemed to, Buford was the first one.
Yes.
But as they came in, they all seemed, that,
Oh,
those
yeah.
are important.
If it hits the fan, that's where we're going. Yes, there's high ground. But Howard, I mean, he is the man who leaves von Steinwehr and his division to hold the hill as a backup force, as reinforcements if need be. So, Reynolds didn't do it. Of course, Reynolds,
Wasn't there
was
long
only
enough
there
to
for
have set up
right.
he was setting up the front, he hadn't gotten to
and
setting up
hadn't
the
thought
back.
about the back yet. Yes. There's real issues about whether Howard gets credit for leaving the hill occupied, but be that as it may, it worked out well.
I don't want to
It
get
also means that suddenly the North fight, the Brickyard fight, and the rest of it, which we were chatting about before we started here, another division up on the North might very well have totally changed the focus of what ended up happening. But
I don't want to, it's really on topic, it's day one. But I think, and of course the movie, and I'm a Chamberlain fan, but the movie highlights Chamberlain.
Yes.
And you can pick George Sears Green and Culp's Hill, and you can pick a whole bunch of points. But that fighting by the Iron Brigade, and both the Cutlers and the Iron Brigade, that fighting early on day one, not only were more guys killed and wounded on
Yes.
day one than
Yes.
any other day in the battle, but that fighting there, you could argue, really saved the entire battle, because it did keep the Confederates off the high ground. The Iron Brigade actually, until, I'm going to take a guess now, till about 10 o'clock in the morning, had actually pushed the Confederates across Willoughby Run
yes.
and had them going the other way. And the killing fields of McPherson's Ridge and Cutler's Brigade in and around the railroad cut, and that,
Yeah.
the slaughter there was tremendous. And the successful holding the Confederates off on day one, in that area of the battlefield, to me is as significant as Little Round Top or Culp's Hill or any of the other things that you.
Yeah, holding the line until reinforcements can come up. You're absolutely correct. The whole First Corps holding that line. One of my research projects is the 104th New York. Second last regiment in line on the far right when Rhodes pours down off of Oak Ridge. The regiment with the highest casualty count, in the brigade with the highest casualty count, in the division with the highest casualty count, in the corps with the highest casualty count on the first day.
They
Gee,
had a
but other than
tough
that, they
day.
did okay.
Yes.
So let's skip ahead to the fighting has taken place to the north and west of town, and it is brutal fighting. And eventually, this delaying action of the Union Army has put in place fall back or run back through town, chased by the Confederates all the way back to Cemetery Hill, and probably at least a small force to Culp's Hill. And General Richard Ewell has been given an order by General Lee to take those hills to the south of town if practicable.
Famous two words.
If practicable.
Worst two words the man could have used with Dick Buell. Yep.
Yeah.
And Lee was known for giving some orders that allowed a general in the field to
Discretion.
discretion. Of course, this is one of the most debated topics of the Civil War. It is played out in the Lost Cause, and if only old Richard Ewell would have taken those two hills, everything would have been different. So
if Stonewall were still
If
alive and received that order, they'd have taken those hills.
I'll
I'll go there.
defend Ewell to a certain degree.
So will I, but
there are some. Okay, he isn't Stonewall Jackson.
yeah, nobody
The
is.
man has one leg. He just got married.
Yep.
It doesn't have the same brilliance as Jackson. He's going to interpret these orders the way he thinks.
And he's been marching and fighing.
He's been fighting all day.
At that point, and
Yes.
I mentioned this earlier, maybe before we started. J.D. Petruzzi talks about, where did Buford go after they broke through? And later on in the day, they were basically cushioning in front of Cemetery Hill. Did you remember J.D. talking about that? It's possible that not everything you said, plus he did see some cavalry support in front of the hill, and that was a small, but another factor about, it's not like there's nobody there. There are some cavalry there. I don't know if you remember him speaking about that in the conference.
No, I didn't go to that conference, but
Okay.
that's a very interesting issue. As soon as you said, where
I
did
thought
Buford
it was,
go?
I thought they were set off to, get more ammunition and rest the horses and,
But a
go
few of them,
something
according to
eat.
J.D., were kind of like riding back and forth in front of the Union
Picketing
lines.
in front of the hills.
Yes.
Oh.
Which might be pretty insignificant militarily, but it's just enough of another factor.
But
that
to a
you-
commanding general, it
to
also
you-
means he's picketing in front of infantry.
Yeah.
And it's getting to be dusk, and I can't see up on the hill very well. If there's cavalry
There's a lot
pickets,
of little things
somebody's
that go
up there
into this.
waiting for me to come up, and if they're waiting for me, I don't want to go up.
Yeah, all that.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
And Lee's on the field at that point.
Yes. Yeah, by
if it
4
was,
o'clock.
If it was that significant, I know it's not Lee's style, but Lee could have said,
Do it.
take those hills.
At whatever cost,
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
those hills.
And he
because
did not.
he had been there long enough to understand the lay of the land, and he knew how important Culp's Hill especially was going to be. I mean, if you can have Culp's Hill at the end of July the 1st, Meade is going to
Retreat.
Pipe Creek.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. So yes, and maybe Lee didn't do it simply because he was so used to having Stonewall when he would give him a discretionary order, if practicable. Stonewall's going to do it. Dick Ewell, not so much. But again,
Rosemary mentioned about initiative and her compliments to Buford about taking the initiative on day one. That's something that Jackson was able to do.
yes,
And Dick Ewell wasn't able to do.
yes. Yeah, the classic Peter principle. I mean, having been made a corps commander, I don't think he ever really grew into it, but what choice did Lee have? You know, you got to split your 2 corps into 3. You need 3 lieutenant generals. Somebody's got to be a lieutenant general. Okay, Dick Ewell, he's there. You know,
Yeah.
he served well under Jackson,
He did.
but he just got a
Got a
command that's
promotion.
beyond him. Right.
Yeah.
You know, A.P. Hill, you can argue that one, but I mean, at least, yeah. But
I don't know if it was beyond him to get that promotion, but I would say that he didn't have the strength, and I don't mean the inner strength of Stonewall Jackson. He didn't have the numerical strength that Jackson had because they did split from
yes,
2 to 3
because
corps.
they
And,
took a lot of the strength
And Jackson
away.
had
That's true.
killed a lot of his soldiers.
Well,
He did, yeah,
Yeah.
but because of his aggressiveness.
Yeah.
mhm.
But we were talking about the beginning of the battle and taking the initiative. And when Ewell comes around, he said, like you were saying, wait a minute. I don't know where everybody is. I don't know where they are.
Right.
So Jackson, he throws caution to the wind and
And yes,
slaughters some of his
Goes.
guys.
Yeah.
we're going to do a reconnaissance in force.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got 14,000 guys. Let's walk up the hill and see what's up there.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas Ewell is going to sit off on the side, looking through field glasses, saying,
He might have been a little gun shy just because of his wound.
"Well, yeah, you know, he's already, right. He's lost one leg. He's going to get another one mangled. Of course, so many of those
Know
guys.
that,
Yeah.
One of the things that I think, you know, you have to give credit to the other side. That is, you've got Greene, who turned out, you know, nobody would have guessed that this old farmer from Vermont
Yes.
was going to be this absolutely amazing battlefield commander.
Yes.
And he was. And I mean, Ewell might have gotten away against somebody that was less, you know, aggressive, but just Greene just dominated that fight.
Yes. Yeah, force of personality, you're absolutely correct. Everything I've read, that man walked up and down that line very much like the Hancock line on the second day. There are times when a major general's life isn't worth, get off your horse, you jackass! No.
Right.
There are times when a major general's life isn't worth, you know, but yeah, Greene, I mean, walking up and down that line, basically just talking to his guys. We're holding this ground, because if you don't, we're all gonna die.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
Not a small target
die
either.
fighting, yeah, die fighting or die running, which is your choice. I'm going to stay here and fight, and everybody else chose to do it. That's an amazing story, and that's
I think
go
it's
back to
a pity
Gettysburg.
that
I
it
think
hasn't
it's a
been-
pity.
It hasn't been one of the ones that's gotten enough
Yes,
credit.
yes,
That Greene really fought a hell of a fight.
absolutely, absolutely.
A lot of grumbling when he kept forcing him to build breastworks and
Yes.
fortifications. What are we
Yes.
doing this for?
Yeah.
But then they
Until-
eventually
yes.
understood
Yes.
how valuable
Yes.
they were.
Uh-huh.
So,
Because that was the
14
first time they were really using the breastwork.
Yes.
And we've all been up there on Cobb's Hill, and we've seen, you know, how nasty it is. I mean, you know, they don't have picks and shovels. What they've got is basically
They're bayonets.
their bayonets
Yeah.
and their
And their hands.
and their canteens.
Yep.
You know, and that's what they're able. They have to move the dirt and the rock, and that's not what any prudent person would choose to reinforce a line. And yet, by the time they got finished reinforcing it, you know, the
Yeah.
old man wasn't so crazy
Oh,
after
yeah.
all.
1,400 of us are stopping 4,800
Especially,
guys.
especially when they took a large portion of his force
And
Yes,
and
then
moved
moved
them
them over
and
to
moved
the
them
other
to the
side.
left.
and
Yeah.
took them down, yes, to
Now you had
strengthen
only
the
like
line.
one man for every 5 feet. It's a good thing you've got those.
Well, yeah,
because
the numbers are, if I remember it correctly, 1,400 men to hold off 4,800. Thank God for breastworks.
Thank God for the
Thank God the
train.
crotchety
Yes.
old guy made us dig holes. Absolutely, yes. And put the dirt up front. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
so the famous fishhook is starting to form.
Yes.
And so you've got Hope's Hill, and then you've got Cemetery Hill. And so by the night of July 1st, and Cemetery Ridge, which is connected to Cemetery Hill. By the night of July 1st, Meade and Hancock realize they have a very good defensive line. And Lee is trying to figure out, what am I going to do tomorrow? And as we've already said, Lee's definitely going to attack tomorrow. It's just
Oh, yes.
a matter of what's the best plan of attack. So there is some reconnaissance that's done. And Lee is really focusing on the Union left flank.
Yes.
And so, is it Johnston that ends up going out?
Johnston, yes.
Johnston,
Yep.
yep. Ends up going out. He believes he makes it to Little Round Top.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Big Round Top.
Yeah.
Maybe he just didn't know where he was.
Maybe,
Which
yeah.
is probably the case. And he says that's wide open.
Yeah.
We can go. We can roll them up on the left, and we can take them
Yeah.
that way.
There's 200 yards from Little Round Top before you get any federal troops on Cemetery Ridge.
When he
not
goes out
according to
there,
all the federal
when he
records.
goes out there, there's no one there.
Yeah,
But in the
that's what he says.
meantime, when he comes back, it becomes occupied, and that's the way I always
Well,
understood
that
it.
could very well be, but the whole thing about Little Round Top is completely vacant. We know they had a
Well,
signal station
yeah,
up there.
I'm not quite sure whether he got there
Right.
anyways, but.
So
But yes, it's definitely bad intelligence that Lee is getting. Oh yeah, they're weak on the left. Well, yeah, but where are all their reinforcements coming from? The left.
right. And that line allowed.
Corps is coming up.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that line allowed reinforcements, which is sort of the theme of Gettysburg, the Union Army to reinforce when they needed
Yes.
reinforcements. And-
Yes.
And
The beauty of the Pike Creek situation was that it would have been interior lines, and you got your main sources of supply directly behind it.
Yes.
Ends up, Gettysburg ends up the exact same thing. Interior lines and the Baltimore Pike, which
Is
is
your-
your main supply route, is directly behind you in the middle.
Right.
And that's an
Feeding,
ideal situation.
feeding right into your entire position. You couldn't have planned it any better. And that's Hancock's report back to Meade after he shows up and
Yeah.
relieves Howard.
Yeah.
Meade is saying, tell me what this ground looks like, and I forget what the exact term is, but basically, okay, we've fallen back to a very defensible ground. We can hold this with good troops, or we can move off if you'd like to. Okay, talk about splitting the baby. Yeah, this is a great spot, unless you want someplace else. Okay, but yes, and so Meade says, okay, I'm coming up, bringing everybody else, we're gonna come up and do this. And as I said, you could not have chosen a better place if you set out deliberately to pick a fight. That's the spot you wanna be. And they've got it by dumb luck.
And so Lee's plan is to attack the left on day
Yes.
2, and he's
Yes.
got this intelligence, and then it's his plan is further changed by Dan Sickles, and and
Here we
just,
go.
just like the Ewell conversation, the Dan Sickles conversation has entertained many a Civil War buff for many years.
Decades.
Decades,
Decades.
centuries, at least one century. Dan Sickles. So the congressman who killed his wife's lover and got off on a temporary insanity plea, just
Argued by Edwin Stanton. Yeah, there you are.
just a few years
Dream
before
team.
Gettysburg, and sort of falls into Lincoln's favor. I think it's Lincoln needed a Democrat, and,
Yes.
and Sickles was a Democrat.
He's a
and-
war Democrat.
yeah, a
Yep.
war Democrat,
Yep.
and so Sickles probably doesn't have any business with a corps, but he ends up in charge of a
hell no.
corps, and he's given orders by General Meade to he's on the Union left flank and to position himself somewhere on Little Round Top or just in front of Little Round Top,
Yes.
and to essentially protect the left of the Union Army. And Sickles makes a decision, and he moves his corps to the Emmitsburg Road, on Peach Orchard and along the road, and leaves the left side, leaves the Union Army completely exposed on Cemetery Ridge.
He opens both of his flanks. I
Yes.
mean, he's got both of them hanging in the air, leaving a salient that can be attacked from 3 directions, and leaving huge gaps between himself and Hancock's Second Corps. I mean, we said this before we started filming. I mean, Hancock's report, right after he sees this, he and John Gibbon are together, and they watch, who's that, Geary's division move forward 3/4 of a mile, and they're looking at each other like, who the hell told them to do that? What moron did this? I mean, there's a 3/4 of a mile gap. Gibbons, send somebody to General Meade and find out if he ordered that. Well, of course, by the time
They got
they
that, the
get
answer
word
was
back,
no.
they're already under attack.
And Hancock saying, you know, don't worry, they'll be tumbling back.
Yeah, they'll be, yeah, yep.
Right.
Although not many of them, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the
But
problem.
and that's one of the things when you have amateurs, and
Yes.
and Dan Sickles was an experienced politician and an
Neophyte,
amateur,
yeah.
an absolute neophyte general.
Yep.
And he got the bejesus beat out of him for the mistake he made at Hazel Grove.
Chancellorsville.
At
yeah.
Chan-
Well,
Chancellorsville.
yeah, at
Yeah.
Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
Well,
And so
but he
he
was
said, "I'm
ordered
never-"
to give up.
That's
Yes.
right, I'm never gonna do that again.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
And
Yeah.
he didn't.
Yeah.
What he did was absolutely
And-
worse.
and yes, I'm not sure you were here when we were discussing that before we started, but yes, when he was ordered off of Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville, and the Confederates moved their artillery up and absolutely devastated Sickles and his corps. And so when he's at Gettysburg and he's looking at what's basically the low ground that he's been ordered to hold, and he's looking out 3/4 of a mile at high ground, that if they put their artillery on that, he's going to be devastated again. And that's, in my opinion, the reason he's decided Hazel Grove is not happening twice in 2
Right.
months.
Yeah.
Against
No,
Dan
I'm
Sickles.
going out.
Yeah.
So,
I can
Matt, know you have-
understand
yes.
that based on his previous experience.
Yes.
And when we talked about initiative before, okay, Buford doesn't have any direct orders. So he takes the initiative
Yes.
on day 1 to fight a delaying action, so to speak, from those hills to protect
Yep.
the high ground. But the issue is the high ground, okay? Sickles gets there, okay, he's had a bad experience at Chancellorsville, he doesn't want to get blasted by Confederate artillery on the high ground, so you could say, well, he took the initiative on his own. But the difference is, he
Yes.
had orders.
Yes. He has
He had
disobeyed.
orders to extend the line to those 2 little hills down there, or at least the first little hill.
Yep.
And that is an order.
Yes.
So when you take the initiative in violation of orders, that's a different
Yes.
situation.
Does that, anybody ever wonder, because I've wondered this, what did Longstreet or maybe John Bell Hood think when they saw Sickles out there? Because my opinion is they thought the same thing that Hancock and Gibbons thought. What the hell
Yes,
is he
he
doing?
doing?
Yes.
Let's go with that.
Yeah.
We know what to do at this point.
Well, they didn't expect to find him there, but then when they did find him there, I agree, their thoughts might have been
Yeah.
something along those lines.
This
Ooh,
is,
we
yeah.
break through them and we're just gonna keep going.
It's like Christmas.
Right, this
Let's,
is true.
let's go
Let's
kill
go.
14,000 guys.
For what it's worth, and Longstreet might have had his reasons for saying it after the war. He said that was some of the hardest fighting, and he actually
Yes.
defended Sickles.
Yes.
So obviously, he might want to defend him after the hard fighting that he had that day. So he didn't. I don't think he expected Sickles there.
No.
But Sickles ends up slowing them to their to get to their ultimate objective,
And,
which
and
is
therein is where all Civil War historians argue forever.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yes,
Yeah.
at the sacrifice of his corps, did he slow down Longstreet's attack enough that enabled Meade to move reinforcements in behind him? Well, yeah, but you sacrificed your corps.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
mean, hello?
Yeah.
I'll argue either way. If I was teasing Matt earlier about this, sure, I'll defend Sickles, and unless somebody else wants to pay me to, prosecute this stupid son of a bitch. But But there's not a doubt in my mind that he would have been court-martialed and probably cashiered, except for he loses his leg.
It's like the most
And-
famous
and
leg in the
so-
world.
Yes, and so all of a sudden, well, you can't court-martial a war hero. And of course, he's also got all of his friends in Washington who immediately leap in, oh, you can't, but yeah, he probably would have gone to prison if he had survived unscathed.
Lincoln visited Sickles in the hotel. What's the big hotel there where everybody
To
goes?
Willard,
The Willard,
to Willard,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So that's
it shows you, yeah.
the first
I mean,
reports
he
from
did.
the battlefield
Yeah.
to him Sickles.
Well, yeah, and yes.
Let me tell you what I did, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let me tell you how I won the battle. Yes,
Yes.
yes. Don't believe the telegrams.
And he argued after the war as
Fake
well
news.
that Meade was a conservative general, and I wanted to make sure we fought that day.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I put my troops in a position where I was
We
going to
had
force him to
fight.
fight. So
Oh, that's one.
the Confederates capture the Peach Orchard, not after this brutal fighting. They captured Devil's Den, and they're making a move on Little Round Top, which is one of the most famous areas of the battle. I think, again, made very famous by
Because of the movie.
the
Yeah.
and Jeff Daniels,
Yeah.
and one of the greatest scenes in movie history.
When
Whether
they come down that hill, I mean, that is really spectacular.
the music and everything, and so Little Round Top is attacked by Alabamians, I believe, under Texans and
Texans.
Alabamians,
Yeah.
Alabama.
Stephen Oates.
and many of them have to. They're first up on Big Round Top, which is
Yes.
there's a wooded rocky hill, and
Yes.
they had to climb up there and either realize they're supposed to attack the other hill, or so they've got to come back down Big Round Top, and they've already done a forced march to Gettysburg.
18 miles.
Yes. So
And not a lot of water.
right. In fact, they have men go to obtain water, and they're captured while they're doing that. So they attack Little Round Top. Now, Chamberlain, the 20th Maine, are ordered to take the left of the Union flank, and I think there's a New York,
44,
44 New York is to their right.
Yep.
Yep.
There's a Pennsylvanian,
83rd,
Pennsylvania was to the left of the 44th.
Yeah.
Okay.
16th Michigan.
And
60
it's all
there you go.
under the command of Strong
Strong
Vincent.
Vincent.
Strong
Yep.
Vincent.
Yeah.
So
As about as good a group of troops as you could ask for.
Yeah.
I mean, those are fine troops.
If you're gonna move a brigade up, you didn't get much better.
The 44th New York had special requirements in order to get in that,
In the
including
beginning,
height.
yeah.
You had to be,
Yes.
you had to get.
It didn't last long, but they had to be 6
There-
footers.
initially-
And they were drawn from all over the state.
That
all
was
those- every
Ellsworth,
word in the state,
Ellsworth.
2 men from every senatorial district in the state of New York was the minimum that was gonna go into that regiment.
And when you enlisted, you had to have a piece of paper with you signed by somebody of prominence saying, yes, I recommend this guy be in this
That I
regiment.
didn't
So,
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a very, I mean, they really wanted to honor.
Well, it was
Elmer
Ellsworth's Avengers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Um,
so they were all there.
Rice wasn't there, Matt, we were talking about James C. Rice when we opened this, and he wasn't their original commanding officer. Stryker, Stryker was, and they kept finding him every time they went to battle. They found him 3 miles in the rear. So finally, he got cashiered
Yeah.
out, and Rice,
Getting more ammunition.
or looking for water, whatever he was going
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
But Rice, who was a lawyer, he wasn't a military man. He did pretty good
Yeah.
for a guy who just inherited during a battle an entire
Yeah.
brigade.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was promoted to brigadier
Brigadier,
general
yeah.
a month after the battle.
So what happens next has been debated, like everything else we've talked about so far. If you read what Ellis Spear said after the battle in many years, and of course Chamberlain lived as long as any, well, not as any,
1913.
unreal. He was a
Very
very
long
old man
time, yes.
when he died. Chamberlain said they were running out of ammunition after the Alabamians and Texans had charged up the hill 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
They held them off, but they were running out of ammunition, and
So they had to use the bayonets.
they had to use the bayonet. And Chamberlain says he ordered a charge. Now, some other accounts have him just ordering the bayonet, and everybody knows what that means. There's another account where there are main dead on the ground, and there's a color regiment that doesn't want them to fall into enemy hands. So they move just to cover their own dead, and that movement then sends a
Leaves
wave.
the rest
You know.
of them down.
So-
yeah.
Yes.
But no matter what happened, I mean, what they did there to hold that position on the left. If they let that position go, then you know that whole left side of the Union Army could be
It was
rolled
going
up.
to-
There has been so much controversy in that little piece of ground
Oh, yeah.
in the last century between Oates and Chamberlain, between Chamberlain and Chamberlain, between Ellis Spear and Chamberlain, that you could, well, books have been written just
Yes.
on
Yeah.
that. I was just there a few days ago. Even Chamberlain's reports, the initial report was supposedly lost, the initial report, that the battle report that he wrote. But it was found that it's actually in Maine right now. Then the government, when they were compiling the records, contacted a lot of officers and gave them the opportunity to correct and make amendments to the original. Chamberlain rewrote it, and of course this was after the battle. In fact, I'm not even sure if it wasn't years after the battle, and rewrote it. Now in that one, he claims he not only ordered a bayonet charge, he said, well, it was like a right wheel. All right, now that's a textbook military maneuver. A lot of people have taken issue with him, saying, oh, he didn't do that. But I want you to, and part of the argument between him and Oates is how far the Alabamians got, and when they were flanking Chamberlain, he kept refusing the line. And it's very possible that he refused the line to the point that it went so far back that it was like a hairpin. In fact, Chamberlain said that he could walk between the lines and stretch out his hands and almost touch both sides of how far back they were, like this. I think he probably ordered a charge, or fixed bayonets and they charged. But if and you can't hear anything, so whether the whole group of them heard him yell bayonet charge, but when the individuals around him began to
Started
charge,
moving.
if the whole line, now I want you to think about this, if the line is like this, and this side charges, these guys are going to charge, and if they stay up with their fellas,
They're gonna sweat.
they're going to do this.
They're gonna wheel.
Right.
And they're going to do that without even an order. They're going to do that to stay up with the other
Stay
ones.
with the others.
Yeah.
so
And
they've
then
got
what
some
made it
protection.
even more successful, is at the same time they're doing that, Company B, which he had sent out to protect the flank,
Yes.
and a few U.S. sharpshooters show up in the Confederates' right rear. So at the same time we're making this bayonet charge, you get some firing at the Confederates from the right rear, and that's enough.
Yep, I'm throwing
Because
my weapon down.
they've had an awful day.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
Yeah,
fighting
those guys,
uphill, they've
three-
been without
three
water,
separate
they've
time,
had a
yeah.
very long marches, you know, I mean, they
Oats.
gave as much as one might expect any group of men to give.
Oates' brother was killed at the base
Yep.
of Little Round Top.
Yeah.
I think he's the real hero of Little Round Top, Colonel Oates.
Well, yes.
So Lee is actually somewhat. There are some successes that he sees in day 2 of fighting. He captures the peach
Yes.
orchard,
Oh, yeah.
which again Sickles
Came-
thought was
came close.
was a position by which you could hammer
Mhm.
the enemy from with artillery. He captures Devil's Den, and it's enough for an aggressive general like Lee to decide that we are going to stay
We're
and
gonna stay
fight.
here, and we're gonna do it again.
And
Yep.
Longstreet is definitely has some reservations, and again, this is a debate that has
Oh, yeah.
taken place.
The lost
The lost cause
Yeah,
again.
absolutely.
And so, so Longstreet has some reservations, and Longstreet says he wants to fight a
Yeah.
swing around again, get
Yeah.
between the Union Army and Washington D.C. and choose
Make
ground of
them
our choosing.
come to us.
Right. And Lee says, they're here, and I'm going to fight them
Yeah.
here. So, and I think something that gets lost on, it's certainly lost on me, is when you go to Gettysburg and you look at the field of Pickett's charge and you say, what the hell was Lee thinking? And of course, you have to take it in context. It was supposed to be a coordinated attack.
Yeah.
There was an attack on Culp's Hill
Yeah.
that was supposed to be simultaneous with Pickett's charge or pretty close to it.
That didn't happen.
Didn't happen. The fight in Culp's Hill is brutal. It happens in the very early morning of July 3rd.
And that's the Federals starting it.
Yes, yes.
It's not Lee
Right.
taking the initiative.
Right, right. And so you've got that, and then you have we can rewind a little bit, but just if anybody wants to talk about that Lee Longstreet, I know it's so saddled in what actually happened and all the politics that happened after the war. The Lost Causers were so eager to beat up Longstreet, who became very good. Who was good friends with U.S. Grant before the war, and was better friends with him after
And
the
then
war.
became a republic.
Yes,
Oh
yes,
my God.
yes.
Yes.
So if anybody wants to talk about their relationship, especially at Gettysburg, I mean, it's very easy to see Longstreet's side of things now. Was Lee crazy? I know the music sort of, or the movie sort of plays him off as a,
Well, yeah,
you know.
a mystic.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
Martin Sheen.
Right,
I
right.
wasn't real fond of that casting, but they didn't ask me. I think the real issue is Lee had his dander up.
Right.
I mean, okay, we've pounded them one day, we kind of tied the second. They got to be weak. We've
Well,
We've tested their-
they've hit both flanks.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the thinking is, well, they must
they
have
must be
reinforced the
weak in
flanks.
the center.
They
They
must
must
be
be
weak in the center.
Plus the lack of intelligence. I mean,
Well,
the
yes.
Sixth Corps hasn't even got into action.
Yes.
For
And of
all
course,
intents and purposes.
Stewart is just arriving
Yes.
back the second day,
And-
so he has not looked.
So
He hasn't
you're,
got a
you're
good-
making an assumption without good intelligence.
Right.
It turned out that it was wrong.
Yeah, and he's overlooking the fact that Meade has interior lines
Yeah.
of support. So even if the center is weak and you hit him in the center, he's got the ability to pull troops in to help protect his center. I for the life of me, I can't understand why Lee could have chosen that as the plan for the third day. I mean, I've read more than I ever want to admit. I've looked at this, and I sit every single time and say, the hell was he thinking? And the only thing I can come up with, he's got his dander up. They're invincible.
And there is.
That's right.
the-
They
I
are
mean, the
invincible.
ANV is
What he did in
invincible.
Chancellorsville.
We
Yes,
can
that is,
do
we can
this.
do it again.
Yes.
My
you know,
Virginians
that
can
we-
do anything.
We
Yeah.
did it, we
There
did
you are.
it at
There you are.
Chancellorsville.
He's under, there's a lot of
We'll
things,
do
there's
this,
a lot
we'll
of
do
factors.
this in the north,
Yeah.
and the war will be over.
Yes. Yep.
The pressure to win, you mentioned supplies, right? Something's gotta happen quickly.
Yes.
There's a pressure to win, he's got faulty intelligence, he makes a wrong decision, and there's that talk about he's not feeling well. There's been
Yeah.
Had major heart
suggestion,
issues, yeah.
yeah, heart problems. And again, I don't think there's any one thing, it was a combination of things, and the wrong decision was made.
And even after it was clear that his plan was not being carried out, and he could have,
And
he
Yes.
could have just said, you know what,
yeah.
We're gonna take it another
yeah,
day.
yes, exactly.
You had something you were gonna.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
Well, no, that's fine. I'm just waiting my turn. I just want to say something that I once heard John Hennessy say. as you all know, he did a lot of research
Oh, yeah.
in southern institutions, libraries and colleges. And he was talking, I forget where, probably the Round Table, and he said that at the Battle of Second Bull Run, okay, Longstreet and a tremendous attack from the left, outflanking the
Yes.
Union left. But in the meantime, there was a big battle up on the railroad cut against Jackson. And it's always interested me that there's a illustration by Alfred Wall or some of the newspaper artists, and he shows two giant blocks of Yankee troops marching up the gentle slope towards the railroad, the
The
railroad
cut,
embankment. And it's like a bird's eye view. So they get up there, and of course Jackson, you know, the Floridians are throwing rocks at him and the whole thing. Where was Lee? Lee was with Longstreet. He didn't see these Yankees creamed by these Confederates behind the quote
Embankments,
entrenchments.
yep.
And not only that, but this man writing his papers or someplace said, I saw a lone horseman coming towards our lines, and as he got closer, I realized he was wearing a gray uniform, and as he approached even more, I realized it was General Lee. He said, I rode out to him and I said, General, what are you doing here? And he said, Lee was as white as a ghost, and he had a crease across his cheek. And he said, those people nearly got me. Now, if this guy was telling the truth, Lee missed one of the significant portions of Second Bull Run. Don't attack uphill against an entrenched enemy with massive columns of troops. And secondly, I'm not sure that he was in a mental position to absorb what had happened in the battle afterwards. I mean, it was successful, wasn't it? Longstreet attacked, drove the Yankees off. So, I haven't seen John in how many years? When are we going to have John Hennessy back?
I saw him 2 years ago at Fredericksburg.
Yeah, but...
Well, part of the problem,
I saw him at the,
part of the problem is his son was quite ill and he couldn't leave home to
Yeah.
do some things. But I believe he's
better now.
better now.
Because he was, I saw him at the Rev War meeting in Fultonville. And he was talking about his son opening up a restaurant down in someplace in the south, and how he and his wife are going to go down to support them. So that there was, he was very interested in family things at that point.
Okay.
Well,
I had asked him one time, 2 or 3, maybe 4 years, time goes, and I asked him about coming up, and he said, I'd love to, you know, because he has a special spot, it was hard for him to go around there. But he at that time, he couldn't leave the boy, couldn't
Okay.
leave home.
Well, I just hope that I'm not putting words in his mouth. But needless to say, when he said that, I mean,
Yeah, that's,
you know, this is the kind of thing you remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember where it was, but that I remember.
But there were a lot of instances in those 2 or 3 battles where Lee seemed to be clearly off his game. Where whether it was physical illness because of persistent diarrhea, or whether it was because of, you know, minor heart attacks, there were just things where Lee was showing his age.
He injured both wrists with his
Yeah.
horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always interested me that Lee, Lincoln, Jefferson Davis all lost a child during the war. What did that do to these men?
Yeah. So on the flip side, and Pickett was asked, at least it was attributed to him at some point after the war, what happened, and he said, well, the Yankees had something to do with it. You know? So and a part of the Yankee artillery was very effective, where the Confederate artillery was not effective at all. So the Confederates are successful, at least some of them, in making it to the angle, right? And there's some
trees.
the copse of trees. There's some hand-to-hand combat.
If we asked the Virginian, they were over the wall first and farther. And if we asked the North Carolinian, they were over the wall first and they were farther.
But ultimately, the men who survived are sent back to Seminary Ridge, and that brings us basically to the end of the fighting at Gettysburg. Now, let's talk about the significance of Gettysburg, which we could spend another 2 hours talking about. We won't do that. We'll get everybody home promptly here.
Debate starts in 22
Oh
minutes.
yeah, right. So you guys will be able to watch the Democratic debate tonight with all 70
Stars.
candidates. How significant was the battle militarily first, and then we'll get into sort of the memory of Gettysburg. And these are questions meant to generate discussion more than to actually answer the question.
Answer anything, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I find great significance in everybody calls it the turning point of the war, and in my opinion, it's not. Vicksburg, which is the exact same time, is the turning point of the war, because that shuts off the Mississippi, and in my opinion, that's the death knell of the Confederacy.
Right.
Once the Union owns the Mississippi River, the Confederates are screwed. I mean, yes, militarily, everybody gets bloodied badly at Gettysburg. Lee cannot make up the losses that he has suffered in any way, both in manpower and equipment, and even his wounded. I read once, I can't remember whose book it is, but roughly 50% of the wounded that he took away from Gettysburg never came back to the Army. I mean, that is a devastating loss. You know, you've lost 4,000 killed, you've got 14,000 wounded you're taking away, but 7,000 of them never come back. That's 11,000 guys that you've just lost. They can't make that up unless, of course,
never effectively were on the offensive after that.
Oh, absolutely. That you're correct there. And then you bring up, well, I don't want to go off on another tangent, but Pat Claiborne saying, well, we got to let's enlist the blacks. Well, wait a second. If they can be soldiers, then this whole slavery thing is clearly wrong. But he can't make up that manpower. Whereas the Union, well, they're drafting and,
And there's a lot of Irish
there's still,
who are coming
still
in.
an awful lot of immigrants. Yes, Germans and Irish are still flocking to this country because this country in a civil war is still a hell of a lot better than what they're leaving. Oh, Honduras, Nicaragua. Oh, never. Sorry. Yes, I'm off my soapbox. So in that sense, I suppose you can call it the turning point because from that point, the Army in Northern Virginia is strictly on the defensive, as Matt just said. They never really are aggressive anymore because they can't be. He just doesn't have the strength. And then, of course, once Grant comes in and starts his, I'm going to hold this line if it takes all summer campaign in the following year, Robert E. Lee is screwed. There's just no way he's getting out of this anymore. So yeah, okay, it's a turning point. I'll give you that. But militarily, I think the other battle of this same week is the one that really seals the Confederacy's death.
But I think psychologically, and talking about it from the perspective of the Union public, you cannot overemphasize the importance of Gettysburg, because if the North had lost that battle, it's game over.
There would have been a peace treaty by the end of
By the end of the summer.
1863.
Yes.
The
There would have
Brits,
been.
I think, would have come in and ordered mediation between the two. They wouldn't have recognized the Confederacy, but they basically would have told Lincoln, we are going to mediate, we're going to do this in London, you are sending ministers plenipotentiary, and so are the Confederates, and you're going to recognize them, and yes. And there wasn't much Lincoln could have done at that point.
No.
Especially if the French threw their hat in, and even though the Russians were kind of on the outs at this time with the Brits and the French, I think the Tsar probably would have leaned on Lincoln as well. And yes, the Confederacy would be, and we'd need a passport to go to Disney World.
Well, and it's interesting because Lincoln was somewhat disappointed, well, very disappointed actually after the battle. So you've got Lincoln who thought that Meade had Lee on the ropes here. And
And he didn't punch.
he didn't punch. Now, Meade actually seems like he looked for the opportunity.
Yes.
He was somewhat cautious, but
Yes.
he's also given conflicting orders to stay between the Confederate Army and Washington.
And Baltimore.
And Baltimore,
Yes,
yes.
protect both of those cities.
So his orders are, somewhat opposing each other. But it's interesting to see that there was disappointment there from Lincoln, and you could have ended the war right there. He wrote the famous letter.
That
Of course,
army-
he didn't send.
Yes.
He didn't send. It's a fascinating letter.
That army was beat up, and except for the Sixth Corps,
Yes.
and that's who, along with the
Sedgwick,
cavalry,
and that's
were
who we sent to
sent
get
to
right.
pursue. You just don't pick up this, after this devastating battle,
Yes.
where the 11th Corps and several of the other corps were
Well, yeah,
absolutely.
the First Corps ceases
First
to
Corps,
exist, the Third Corps is gone, the 11th Corps is shattered.
And he
The
did
Second
send
Corps
the
has
one
been beat
remaining
up.
corps that
It's
he had
in
that was
pretty
pretty
good
well
shape, but it's been
fresh.
It's been pretty beat
Yeah.
up.
And I think he did about what he could do.
Yeah,
under the
I'm not
circumstances.
troubled, having read as much as I have about it. I mean, once Lee got to the shores of the Potomac and entrenched because the river is too high, and the Sixth Corps catches up to them and take a look at the entrenchments that are there, and it's like, am I going to lose my corps now? No, I'm going to write back to General Meade and tell him we've got him pinned against the river, and I'm waiting for you guys to come up. Yeah, and if he happens to get across the river while I'm waiting for you to come up, I'm okay with that.
Right.
Because I'm not going to lose my corps, because, right,
We've gotta have one, we've gotta have
We've gotta
at
have
least
at
two more
least,
fighting
yes.
corps.
yes.
And the weather wasn't that cooperative in the pursuit either. So
Well, yeah, I mean, the rain, of all things in the world, in July in Virginia, and it's raining so hard that the river has risen. I mean, usually in July in Virginia, the river's the lowest you've ever seen.
Right.
But now all of a sudden it's flooded.
Well, and the war lasts 2 more years, and like you said, Lee's on the defensive the entire
21
time,
months.
but it's it's turning point. I can see it, and I also you've got 2 more years, a lot more men die, and there are a couple opportunities not for Lee to win the war outright, but again to lean on the
Yes.
political side
Yes.
of these things and really play on the war weariness of the North and the war Democrats that are starting to gain some momentum, towards 64, and of course George McClellan being one of them. Of course, he loses the election to Lincoln.
Right.
But McClellan is saying we're going to restore slavery, and we're gonna come to some sort of peace.
Well, the one point I would like to make about that, about the turning point, the whole thing, it really is funny if you pay attention to the British view of the war. Gettysburg is the last time that you see even the most rabid pro-Southern British politicians saying we should
Come in on the
yes,
side
we
of
should
the
either come in
Confederate.
or just recognize the Confederate. They all stop. I mean, Gettysburg is the death knell of the British idea about supporting the South, because they'd love to see the North American continent broken up into 6,
They'd
7,
love
8
to
different
see-
countries.
They'd love to see
The
a renewed
balkanization.
supply of cotton. is
Well,
what
yeah, well, but at that point, the Egyptian
It
cotton is
had come
starting
in,
to
yes,
arrive in
yeah.
heavy flow, so they're not too worried about
I
king
think there
cotton
was,
anymore.
there was some cost with, well, you said Egyptian, there was cotton from India too, and that was a costly venture.
Yes, but it's actually the Egyptian cotton that saves the British mills for the last half of our Civil War, and then it's the Indian cotton. But the Brits would love to see North America broken up into a couple of different countries. They're smart enough to recognize that a continental United States is going to be a world power. And if there's one thing the current world power doesn't want to see, it's another world power. And so, yes, they'd love to have us have to get a passport to go to Disneyland and have the Midwest break away and have the Southwest break away and California becoming an independent nation. And but it really does. I'm trying to remember the name of the book that was done a couple of years ago. I'm stuck on the fires of war, and that's not the title. Massive book about the British outlook on the American.
The lady author.
Yes. She's not dead enough for me to remember her name. An excellent book, and I mean, it really is. It makes that point so clearly. I mean, once Gettysburg, once the word gets that Lee's second invasion of the North has failed, and he has retreated with his tail between his legs, even the most rabid pro-Southern politicians all just stop. Oh, okay, looks like we've lost this one. Well, yeah, the only two people who don't recognize that are Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. But, well, maybe, but.
There's also a big effect, the Battle of Gettysburg left a big effect on the federal troops that were in the Army of the Potomac. Because the first 2 years of the war, they were being slapped around.
They got their butts kicked.
And now they have a commander, and they're saying, hey, now we have a chance. Because
Yes.
the failed commanders before them weren't pressing the issue. There was also a lot of time in between battles. So the following year, when Grant comes in, he's saying, we're not going to wait. We're going to go after him here.
We're going to hold.
And he kind of used Robert E. Lee's line saying, he's there, that's where we're going to attack him. So that's where I think it was the big turning point, because the Army of Northern Virginia was considered the head of the snake. And they did have to chop that off. I agree with Michael when it's hard to believe I agree with Michael ever. but no,
You're a
Vicksburg.
good-looking man.
Vicksburg,
That's a lie.
Vicksburg was just as important in the Western theater as I
But
think
the
Gettysburg was in
but
the
the
Eastern theater.
problem for I mean, in the reality of the two theaters is that the coverage, the media coverage in the East is so much more intensive than the media coverage in the West. So that even though you have two events where I think we would all probably agree that the Vicksburg campaign was in the long run more important than the Gettysburg campaign, but still from the perspective of the people who were reading the papers and were talking to each other in church and all of the rest of the things,
Yes.
Gettysburg was more important.
Yeah, that's where the big voting centers were. In the
Yes,
Northeast.
in the Northeast.
So,
Yes.
yeah, they had
It's their boys that are fighting,
Oh, yeah.
where they're paying attention. You know, the Vicksburg, well, they're from Wisconsin and Minnesota. Is that even in America?
It's kind of like saying Troy.
Yeah.
Well,
I have a knife
There
here.
can be some arguments made. Militarily, definitely so, in that he never was on the offensive again.
Yeah.
And diplomatically, as you say. But a recent book came out. One of the young fellows who contributed is by a number of Civil War authors on this very topic. And Chris Galikowski, I believe, will tell you about the number of times in 1862 that the Confederates were stymied in the middle part of the United States. It can be argued that in the overall scheme of things, that Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation had a tremendous effect on the purpose and the outcome of the war. In different areas, you can make some arguments the other way, but I would tend to agree with what we've said about Gettysburg.
Well, I think with that, because we could go all night, and there's a debate to watch, and there's other things going on. So I just want to thank everybody here: Michael Barrett, Mark Bodner, Rosemary Nichols, Matt George, Bob Mulligan, for joining me and talking about this. I hope you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you guys for coming. I hope
This was fun.
I hope that we can do it again. I mean, you know, if there's
Take
something that
another
we,
topic,
absolutely, and we'll do it again. And with that, thank you guys for